You need to clear out your desk by end of day." The woman who said that was standing at the head of a conference table that seated 22 people. Her voice didn't waver, her posture didn't either. She was wearing the navy blazer she'd bought herself for her birthday, the one she'd pointed at in the store window and said, "Someday," before the word stopped meaning what it used to mean. The man she was firing sat 3 seats down from the head of the table. He hadn't touched the coffee in front of him. He was watching her the way someone watches a clock that's running wrong. Not with anger, not quite, but with the specific kind of attention you give something you already understand and aren't surprised by. "Effective immediately," she said. "Security will escort you out." He set his pen down on the folder in front of him. The folder was embossed with a company logo, her company's logo, and the access cards she added. He slid the folder toward her. He didn't open it. The room went absolutely still. His name was Donovan Marsh. What she didn't know, what none of them in that room knew, was that every dollar that had built the company around them, every lease on every office floor they stood on, every vendor contract and equity stake and line of credit that kept the lights on, traced back to a single holding structure. And that structure had one beneficial owner. What would you do if the person who'd spent 3 years trying to erase you had been living, the entire time, inside a house you'd built? If this is the kind of story that makes you feel something, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense without it. Donovan Marsh grew up in the kind of household where money was discussed the way illness is discussed, in lowered voices with careful euphemisms, as if naming it too directly might make it worse. His father, Raymond Marsh, had been an electrician in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a man who wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation and kept a brass level on the kitchen counter instead of in the toolbox, because he liked to see it every morning. He said the bubble in the center of a level was the only honest thing in the world. Everything else, he believed, was capable of lying to you if you gave it enough reason. Raymond died when Donovan was 26 weeks after a diagnosis that arrived too late for anything useful to be done. He left Donovan 3 things: the level, a deed to a small warehouse in an industrial district outside Pittsburgh that he'd been paying down quietly for 11 years, and a handwritten note that contained exactly 1 sentence: "Don't let anyone tell you what your name is worth." Donovan spent the following 4 years not spending much. He slept on a futon in the warehouse while he converted it, taught himself construction logistics from borrowed textbooks and YouTube videos at 2 in the morning, and made a series of decisions that, in retrospect, were either very lucky or the result of the kind of sustained attention that only people with nothing to distract them tend to apply. He bought adjacent properties when the market dipped in 2018. He built a small commercial real estate portfolio that he kept inside a holding company called Meridian Capital Group, a name deliberately chosen to sound like a mid-tier financial services firm rather than anything memorable. When the properties started generating significant cash flow, he didn't change his lifestyle in any visible way. He kept the truck, he kept the flannel shirts. He kept the brass level on his kitchen counter, the one that had been his father's. He had a reason for the discretion that wasn't just preference. At 23, before any of the warehouse, before any of the portfolio, he'd been in a relationship with a woman named Patricia Holt, who'd been charming and specific about her love for him right up until the moment a distant uncle died and left Donovan an inheritance of $340,000. Patricia's behavior changed within 6 days of that news. The relationship ended 9 months later, but the education it provided lasted considerably longer. Donovan Marsh learned with painful clarity that visible wealth changes the way people see you in ways that are almost never to your benefit, and that the only way to know whether someone valued you was to make sure they couldn't clearly see the difference between you and anyone else. He carried that lesson into every relationship after Patricia. He carried it into his marriage. He met Serena Vance at a charity auction in the spring of 2019, not as a significant donor, which he was, but as a volunteer helping manage the event logistics, which was how he'd presented himself to the organizing committee. She was there as a guest of her mother, Margaret Vance, a woman who collected invitations to charity events the way other people collect opinions, constantly, with great conviction that each new one confirmed what she already believed. Serena was different from her mother in ways that at the time seemed meaningful. She laughed at things that weren't supposed to be funny. She was studying interior design with genuine enthusiasm for the structural problem of it, the way a room's proportions determined how people felt in it without knowing why. She noticed the brass level in Donovan's truck when she reached in to retrieve a dropped earring on their second date, and she had asked about it with actual curiosity rather than polite interest. They were married 14 months later in a small ceremony that Donovan had quietly paid for through a personal account rather than through any Meridian structure, because that was the kind of accounting discipline he maintained as naturally as breathing. Serena knew he owned some commercial properties. She had a general comfortable understanding that he did all right. She didn't ask for specifics, and he didn't offer them, and in the early years of their marriage this arrangement felt less like concealment and more like the peaceful absence of a subject that didn't need addressing. He worked, for appearances, as a facilities consultant, a plausible title that explained occasional site visits, and an irregular schedule, and the kind of unglamorous professional life that produced no strong opinions from anyone at dinner parties. Serena's friends accepted this without interest. Margaret Vance accepted it with the specific. Performative tolerance of a woman who has decided her son-in-law is a disappointment she intends to manage graciously. The first 2 years were, by any honest accounting, good. Serena and Donovan renovated a house together outside of Columbus, Ohio. She handled the interiors with the precision and pleasure she brought to everything spatial, and he handled the structural work himself on weekends, which she found charming in a way she said she didn't entirely understand. They cooked on Sunday nights. They argued about things that didn't matter and resolved them without residue. He kept the brass level on the kitchen windowsill, and she left it there because she'd understood without being told that it wasn't decorative. The change didn't happen all at once. That was the thing Donovan would later come back to when he tried to identify a moment. There wasn't one. Erosion rarely announces itself. It started with Margaret. Margaret Vance had a talent for a particular kind of conversation that functioned less like discussion and more like slow pressure applied to a specific point. She'd begun visiting their home in Columbus more frequently in the summer of Donovan and Serena's third year of marriage, and each visit produced a version of the same exchange, which always began with an observation about someone else and ended, through a series of pivots that were almost admirable in their construction, with an implied criticism of Donovan. The Harrington girl, you remember Claire? Her husband just moved them to the Lake Erie house full-time, not as a vacation property, as their primary residence. Can you imagine? A man who simply decided the lake house was more appropriate for daily life. A pause. What a thing to have options like that. Serena would say something neutral. Margaret would respond with another observation. And the visit would end with nothing explicit said, but with a residue that Donovan had begun to notice was accumulating in the way Serena looked at their house, their life, their budget discussions. He watched it happen with the same attention he gave a property assessment, methodical, unemotional, looking for the load-bearing elements that were beginning to stress. Then came Kellen Burke. Kellen Burke arrived in Serena's professional life in the fall of their 4th year, when she started working for a small interior design firm called Vela Studio that had recently taken on a major commercial contract. Kellen had brought the contract in, a boutique hotel renovation in downtown Columbus, and he'd arrived at the firm's offices in a black Range Rover with a custom matte finish and a watch that Donovan's assistant would later identify as a Patek Philippe reference 5711. Retail value $61,000 at the time of its discontinuation and considerably more on the secondary market. The first time Donovan heard Kellen's name was at dinner on a Tuesday night in November, mentioned as a professional detail. The second time was the following Thursday, and there was something different in the texture of that mention. Not the words, which were still professional, but the rhythm of them. The way they arrived in the conversation without being prompted by anything that preceded them. Donovan Marsh set down his fork. He didn't say anything. He was the kind of man who knew how to file something away without showing the filing. Over the following 3 months, Kellen Burke moved from professional mention to social fixture. He had a way of appearing at the perimeter of things, at the firm's holiday event, which Serena attended and Donovan did not because of a site visit he couldn't reschedule, at a restaurant lunch that Serena mentioned afterward as a working lunch and described in enough detail to indicate it had not entirely been one. Kellen spoke about a property he was developing in Scottsdale. He spoke about a trip to Monaco for a friend's birthday. He arrived at a gallery opening that Donovan and Serena attended together in February, wearing a coat that cost more than most people's car payments, and he shook Donovan's hand with the specific warmth of a man who has already decided what he thinks of you. "Serena tells me you're in facilities management," Kellen said. "Consulting," Donovan said. "Commercial properties." Kellen nodded with the enthusiasm of someone giving a child credit for a good guess. Solid, stable work. Serena laughed at something Kellen said 40 minutes later across the room. It wasn't her normal laugh. It was the performed version of it, the one calibrated for a specific audience. Donovan drove home alone that night. Serena stayed for another 40 minutes and arrived at the house 15 minutes after him, and when she came through the front door she was still wearing the expression of someone who'd been somewhere they found more interesting than where they were going. He looked at the brass level on the kitchen windowsill. The bubble sat exactly centered between its two lines. He went to bed without saying anything at all. By March, Kellen Burke had become a daily presence in the architecture of their marriage. Not visibly, not in any way Donovan could have pointed to in a single conversation, but structurally, the way a load-bearing element can shift and the whole building can tilt before any single crack appears. Serena began talking about the hotel project with the specific animation of someone describing something they experience as central to their identity. She began working later. She began mentioning, with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety, that Donovan's professional life lacked visibility, that what he did was difficult to explain at social functions, difficult to contextualize, difficult to be proud of in the specific way that required an audience. Margaret, naturally, agreed. Amen. Kellen's age, already at that level, Margaret said at Sunday dinner in March, cutting her lamb without looking up. It's the ambition. You can see it in a man when it's real. Some men simply have it, and some men simply don't. Donovan passed the bread. He didn't look at Serena to see whether she agreed. He already knew. What neither Serena nor Margaret understood, what they had no reason to consider, was that the hotel Kellen Burke was developing in Columbus, the centerpiece of his whole convincing performance of ambition and consequence, was being financed through a commercial lending vehicle. And that commercial lending vehicle's primary secured creditor was a firm called Meridian Capital Group, which meant that every square foot of Kellen Burke's most impressive project existed because Donovan Marsh had agreed to fund it. Donovan had not known when Meridian extended that credit line 9 months earlier that the borrower would end up standing in his living room making implications about ambition. He knew it now. He filed it. He waited. Kellen Burke's introduction to Serena's professional circle had been accompanied by a status prop that Donovan noted with precision, not just the watch, not just the Range Rover, but a framed photograph in Kellen's office, which Serena described to Donovan in passing one evening, of Kellen on what appeared to be a 70-foot sailing yacht in the Mediterranean, taken at a particular angle that emphasized the vessel's scale relative to the harbor. Donovan's assistant, Oliver Reed, would later establish that the vessel had been a charter. The charter fee for the week in question had been $47,000. Kellen had split it with 3 other passengers. The photograph stayed on the wall. The impression it created stayed in the room, and Donovan Marsh kept watching, kept filing, and kept his hands steady, because he was his father's son and his father had taught him that the bubble in the center of a level doesn't lie. And neither does patience when applied with sufficient precision. The discovery did not arrive as a single moment. It assembled itself across 4 days in April, the way a structure reveals its failure points not in one dramatic collapse, but in a sequence of small wrong sounds that a trained ear can hear before anyone else. It began with an invoice. Donovan had always had a system, for managing the administrative overlap between his personal life and his Meridian operations. His assistant, Oliver Reed, handled most of the Meridian paperwork, but certain vendor invoices flowed through a shared accounting platform that Donovan reviewed personally. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of April, he opened the platform to approve a routine utility payment and found an invoice that shouldn't have been there. It was from Vela Studio, the interior design firm where Serena worked. The invoice was addressed to Kellen Burke's development entity, a Delaware-registered LLC called Harrow Properties Group. It itemized $218,000 in design consultation fees for Phase 1 of the Columbus Hotel project. That was not the anomalous part. The anomalous part was the billing contact listed at the bottom of the invoice, Serena Marsh, Senior Design Lead. Serena's title at Vela Studio was Junior Associate. She had been a junior associate for 14 months. He knew this because he'd asked casually 2 months ago whether she was enjoying the work, and she'd described it with the specific frustration of someone waiting for a promotion that hadn't come. She had not mentioned that she was apparently billing clients at a senior rate under a title she hadn't been given. He didn't close the invoice. He screen captured it and forwarded it to Oliver with a single line, "Can you pull everything Meridian has on Harrow Properties Group? Full credit file, all draw history, every contact name on the account." Oliver's reply came back in 47 minutes. Donovan read it at the kitchen table while Serena was upstairs. The document Oliver attached was 23 pages. Donovan read all 23. The credit line Meridian had extended to Harrow Properties Group was for $2 million. The draw history showed $1. $9 million dispersed across 7 installments over 8 months. 3 of those installments, totaling $890,000, had been drawn against change orders submitted by Vela Studio. Each change order was signed as the authorized design representative by Serena Marsh. Serena Marsh, whose title was Junior Associate, did not have signatory authority over change orders of that scale. The firm's principal, a woman named Dana Park, had that authority. Dana Park's signature appeared on none of the 3 change orders in question. Donovan set the document down on the table. He picked up the brass level from the windowsill and held it in both hands the way he sometimes did when he needed the weight of something real. The bubble sat centered. The house was level. Everything else was not. He understood, in the way you understand things you've been seeing assemble for longer than you've acknowledged, what the invoices meant. Serena had been granted the access. Kellen had arranged for it. Together they had been drawing down credit extended by Donovan's own company to fund a scheme that funneled design fees to a Vela Studio account where Serena's elevated title, fictional, unpaid, strategically placed, gave legal cover for the draws. The hotel project was real. The construction was real. But the change order structure was a laundering mechanism, and Serena was inside it. He sat at that table for 22 minutes. He felt something he would later describe to Oliver only as a temperature, not anger which runs hot, but something colder and more structural, the way a building goes cold in winter, not because the heat has failed, but because the walls have been letting it out for months without anyone noticing. He texted Oliver, "Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. My office." He went upstairs. Serena was already asleep. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a moment, looking at the woman he'd married with genuine feeling, and what he noticed was not fury but the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something without knowing its full weight and has only just put it down long enough to measure it. He went back downstairs. He didn't sleep that night. Oliver Reed had worked with Donovan for 6 years, long enough to understand that when Donovan asked for something methodically, it meant he already knew most of the answer and was building towards something that required documentation rather than conjecture. When Donovan arrived at the Meridian office at 7 the following morning and laid the 23-page credit file on the conference table alongside the Vela Studio invoice and 3 additional documents he'd pulled himself overnight from the accounting platform, Oliver looked at the arrangement on the table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" "The first change order was 8 months ago," Donovan said. "I want to know whether this was the first project or whether there are others. I'll need access to the full Harrow file, their LLC registration history, and any cross-references in the Meridian system to Vela Studio's entity filings. You have everything you need to pull all of that." "I know," Oliver said. "I'm telling you it's going to take me 3 days to do it properly." "Then take 3 days," Donovan said. "Do it properly." Oliver pulled a legal pad from his bag and uncapped a pen. He had the specific focus of someone who'd been waiting for a reason to do exactly this kind of work. "Do you want Serena to know we're looking?" "No," Donovan said. "I want her to keep doing exactly what she's doing." Oliver wrote something on the pad. "And Kellen Burke? I want to know everything about Harrow Properties Group, every entity connected to it, every signatory, every bank account that's received a draw from Meridian Credit. I want to understand what this was actually for. The hotel is real, so the money didn't just disappear. I want to know where it went and why the change order structure was necessary." "That part," Oliver said, "is going to be the interesting part." He was right. The following morning, Oliver arrived at the office with a manila folder and the expression of a man who has found exactly what he expected and wishes he hadn't. He set the folder on the table. Harrow Properties Group is one of 4 LLCs registered by a holding entity called Burke Consolidated, he said. Burke Consolidated has been under informal review by the SEC's Columbus Regional Office for 7 months. Preliminary review, not formal investigation, but the flags are there. The Meridian credit line isn't the only one. Harrow has taken on 3 additional credit facilities from 2 other commercial lenders in the past 14 months. Total exposure? Donovan said. Across all 4 lenders, Harrow's drawn $2 million. The hotel project's construction costs are approximately $8 million. The remaining $4 million net of fees and overhead. Appears to have moved through a series of intercompany transfers between Harrow and 2 other Burke consolidated entities. One of those entities has a single-member ownership structure. Oliver paused. The member is Kellen Burke's mother. Donovan looked at the folder. He's been transferring borrowed construction funds to a family account through a structure that requires a design signatory on each change order to justify the draw. Without the change orders, there are no draws. Without the draws, the money doesn't move. Oliver set a second document on top of the first. The 3 change orders signed by Serena, they account for $890,000 of the $4 million that moved to Burke's family entity. The rest came from the other lenders through different signatories at different firms. She wasn't the only one. But she was the only one at a firm that had a pre-existing credit relationship with Meridian. That's what made the Vela account useful specifically to Burke. Donovan sat with that for a moment. Serena's involvement was not an accident. She had been chosen because of her connection, however indirect, to Donovan, not because Kellen cared about Serena, not because of anything that resembled genuine feeling. She was a mechanism. The marriage was an adjacency he'd decided to leverage. Does she know what she signed? Donovan said. That's the question, Oliver said. The change orders are facially legitimate. They describe real work, real materials, real scope. Someone would have to understand the intercompany transfer structure to see them as fraudulent on their face. It's possible she knew. It's also possible she was told they were routine authorizations and signed without fully understanding the downstream structure. What's your read? Oliver thought for a moment. My read is that she knew enough to know she shouldn't ask more questions. Whether that rises to criminal knowledge or just willful convenience, that's a distinction I'd want an attorney to draw. Donovan nodded. Get me one. I already called Cecilia Frost this morning, Oliver said. She's available tomorrow at 9. Cecilia Frost was a commercial fraud attorney with 17 years of practice and a reputation in the Ohio legal community for being, as her clients frequently described her, exactly as relentless as necessary and not 1 degree beyond. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had the habit of removing them entirely when she was about to say something important, as if she wanted nothing between her eyes and whoever she was addressing. She met with Donovan and Oliver the following morning and spent 45 minutes reading the documents without speaking. When she finished, she removed her glasses. The change orders are the central issue, she said, if the signatures were obtained through misrepresentation. If Burke told your wife these were routine authorizations and didn't disclose the downstream transfer structure, she may be a victim here as much as a participant. That's a factual question and a legal distinction I'd want to explore before anyone makes any accusations. And if she knew, Donovan said, then she's a participant in what is, at minimum, a civil fraud against Meridian Capital Group and potentially a criminal conspiracy charge in conjunction with Burke's existing sex scrutiny. Cecilia set the glasses on the table. What I'm going to need is access to her communications with Burke, texts, emails, anything that shows the nature of her knowledge about the transfer structure. I can get those, Oliver said. Donovan looked at the wall. I want to understand one more thing, he said. Meridian's $2 million credit line, what's our exposure if Harrow defaults? Cecilia was already ahead of the question. The collateral on the Meridian facility is the hotel property itself. The construction is far enough along that the asset has real value. You're covered on the credit facility. The issue is not your financial loss. She paused. The issue is that your company was used as a vehicle in a fraud, and your wife's signature was the mechanism that made it work. If that becomes public before you manage it on your terms, it creates a reputational problem for Meridian that is harder to address than the legal one. I want to manage it on my terms, Donovan said. Then we have work to do, Cecilia said, and I'd suggest we move deliberately. 3 days later, Oliver had obtained, through entirely lawful means and the assistance of a digital forensics consultant Cecilia retained, a comprehensive export of the communications between Serena's professional email account and Kellen Burke's. The exchange dated back 11 months. Oliver read them in full. He came to Donovan's office afterward and set a printed summary on the desk. She knew the structure wasn't routine, he said. There's an email from Burke to your wife 8 months ago that explicitly describes the change order mechanism as a pipeline for internal recapitalization. That phrase appears in 3 subsequent emails from your wife asking about the next draw authorization. She wasn't misled about what she was doing. Donovan looked at the summary without picking it up. Is there anything in those communications about me? Oliver was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. He set a second page next to the first. In a text exchange from 5 months ago, Burke describes the Meridian credit relationship and refers to you by name. He says, and I'm quoting directly, your husband's little property fund is the anchor lender for this whole structure. He has no idea he's underwriting his own cuckold arrangement. The room was very still. Donovan sat back in his chair. He was not going to let himself feel what was available to be felt in that moment. Not yet. Not in the middle of the work that still needed doing. He filed it. He would come back to it later. How long until Cecilia's ready to file? He said she wants 1 more week. She's coordinating with the SEC contact in the Columbus office. Tell her she has it, Donovan said. 1 more week. He'd been tempted, the night before, to confront Serena directly, to come home and set the email summary on the kitchen table and watch her face when she read what had been sent about their marriage by the man she'd been helping. He could see the scene clearly. He understood its appeal. But he also understood, with the patience his father had taught him through example rather than instruction. That confronting early would close off everything he was still building. It would give Burke and Serena time to coordinate. It would compromise Cecilia's filing. It would give Margaret Vance, who had access to every corner of their family communication, a warning she would immediately put to use. He went home that evening. He sat in the kitchen. He moved the brass level from the windowsill to the counter in front of him and looked at it for a long time while Serena cooked dinner in the adjacent space and talked about the hotel project with the ease of someone who had no idea what was coming. Kellen wants to throw a project completion party, she said. Some kind of stakeholder event in the boardroom before the final phase wraps. He thinks it's good for investor relations. Donovan said he thought that sounded like a good idea. He meant it, for reasons she couldn't have understood. The boardroom event was scheduled for the second Thursday in May at 11 a.m. in the conference space on the 14th floor of the building that housed Vela Studios' offices. Kellen had invited what he described, in the event announcement, as the project's key stakeholders and investor partners. The phrasing was precise in its vagueness. The 14 people in that room when Donovan arrived included Vela Studios' principal Dana Park, 3 representatives from regional real estate development associations, 2 attorneys who worked with Burke Consolidated, and 4 individuals identified as investors in the Harrow Hotel project. Donovan arrived 4 minutes before 11. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he always wore, dark trousers, a gray button-down, no tie. He carried nothing. Oliver was parked 2 blocks away with Cecilia Frost in the back seat of a car. Serena was already in the room when Donovan walked in. She was standing near the window with Kellen, and the way she turned when she heard the door was the way you turn when you're not expecting someone whose presence recalibrates something. Donovan, her voice had the quality of a correction made in real time. I didn't think, this is a professional event. What are you doing here? Kellen mentioned stakeholders, Donovan said. I thought I should represent Meridian's interests. Kellen, to his credit, held his expression for a full 3 seconds before something moved in it. Meridian, he said the word the way you say a word you recognize but can't immediately place. Meridian Capital Group, Donovan said. We hold the primary credit facility on the Harrow Hotel project. $2 million extended 14 months ago. We're the anchor lender. I thought we should have a seat at the table." The room had gone from the ambient noise of professional gathering to something else. Dana Park, standing near the far wall, set down her coffee. One of the two attorneys looked at the other attorney. Serena turned to look at Kellen. "This is a private project event," she said. And her voice had the quality of someone trying to establish a rule while a rule is being broken. "You're not invited. You don't have the authority to uninvite our primary lender from a stakeholder meeting," Donovan said. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He set his hands on the table in front of him. He wasn't performing ease, he felt it. The specific settledness that comes from having waited long enough and prepared well enough that the moment itself holds no surprises. "Shall we talk about the project?" Serena moved toward him. She was 3 feet away when she said it, said what she said in the hook, the words she'd been building toward for the last several months of their marriage. The distillation of every dinner conversation and every borrowed comparison and every look that had carried the weight of a verdict. "I want you removed," she said. "Security can escort you out. You're an embarrassment." "Effective immediately," Donovan said. She stopped. "You want to clear out my desk by end of day," he said. "You want the access cards." Something moved across her face that had no single name. "Serena," he said, and he used her name the way his father used tools, with precision, without waste. "I want to show you something." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a single document, folded twice. He set it on the table and slid it toward her without opening it. "That is a certified copy of the beneficial ownership filing for Meridian Capital Group. One owner. One name." She looked at the document. She didn't pick it up. "Go ahead," he said. She picked it up. She opened it. She read the name. She read it twice. She set it back on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have stopped feeling reliable. The room was completely still. One of the investor representatives had taken out his phone and put it away again. Dana Park was looking at the document from across the table as if she could read it at that distance. "Donovan Ray Marsh," Kellen said slowly. He'd read it too, had been reading it over Serena's shoulder, and his voice had the quality of someone recalibrating something significant. "You're the Meridian principal." "I am," Donovan said. "Which means the $2 million credit line your company drew against, the one your change order structure used to move $890,000 through 3 fraudulent authorizations to a Burke consolidated family entity, belongs to me. Every dollar of it." One of the attorneys stood up. "Sit down," Cecilia Frost said. She had walked through the door during the last 30 seconds, and she moved to the table with the particular economy of someone who has been doing this long enough that she doesn't need to hurry. Oliver came through the door behind her and stood near the wall. "My name is Cecilia Frost," she said to the room. "I represent Meridian Capital Group. This morning a civil suit was filed in Franklin County Court against Harrow Properties Group, Burke Consolidated, and 2 named individuals for commercial fraud. The suit documents the change order mechanism in full, including the 3 authorizations we're requesting the court to review." She set a stack of folders on the table, 14 copies, one for each person in the room. The Sex Columbus Regional Office has also been notified. Their inquiry, which was already preliminary, will be elevated to formal investigation status by end of business today. No one touched the folders. Kellen Burke was standing very still, the particular posture of a man who has decided that moving might be the wrong choice. "You didn't even know," Serena said. Her voice was directed at Donovan, and it had the quality of something coming apart along a seam. "All this time you were the money behind everything." "I built the money behind everything," Donovan said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. He was not enjoying this in any way that felt clean. But he was not going to pretend it was different from what it was. He'd spent 11 months watching the architecture of their marriage corrode from the inside, and now he was standing in the ruin of it, and he'd known it would feel exactly like this. Not triumphant, not even particularly sad, just true. "You could have told me," she said. "No," he said. "I really couldn't have." Dana Park cleared her throat. She looked at Cecilia. "Is the firm implicated?" "Vela Studio is named in the suit as the entity through which the change orders were processed," Cecilia said. "Your exposure depends on what your firm's documentation shows you knew about the authorization structure. I'd suggest you retain counsel before you say anything further." Dana Park nodded once and picked up her phone. Kellen Burke looked at Donovan across the table. His expression had completed its journey from performance to something raw and more honest, the look of a man who has built an entire architecture of impression and watched it depressurize in real time. "The hotel," he said. "The project's real. The construction is real. We can work this out. The hotel's collateral will cover Meridian's exposure," Donovan said. "That was always my floor. What you did beyond that floor is between you and the court. I'll give you whatever you want," Kellen said. "Come on, man to man." Donovan looked at him for a moment. "That's the third time you've misparsed this situation," he said. "This isn't about what I want." He stood up from the table. He straightened the chair behind him with the automatic care of someone who puts things back where they belong. He looked at Serena one more time, and she was still holding the beneficial ownership document in both hands, and she looked the way a person looks when they've been standing in a building they thought they understood, and have just been shown the blueprint. "The folder," she said. "In the conference room. You slid it to me. The filing," he said. "So you'd have a copy." She put the document down on the table. She didn't say anything else. Donovan picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He nodded to Oliver. He walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The door closed behind him. In the hallway, he exhaled once, a measured, deliberate release. The kind of breath you take when you have been holding something for a long time and have finally set it on a surface that can hold its weight. He stood there for exactly 4 seconds. Then he walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. What followed the boardroom was not dramatic in the way the boardroom itself had been dramatic. It was methodical. It was documentation and depositions and a series of Friday afternoon calls with Cecilia Frost in which she relayed developments in the tone of someone reading a building inspection report, specific, measured, entirely without surprise. The formal investigation the SEC's Columbus Regional Office opened in the second week of May covered Burke Consolidated's 4-entity structure and all 14 credit facilities Harrow and its sister companies had drawn against across 3 lenders in 18 months. The total exposure across those facilities was $7 million. The intercompany transfer mechanism, the one that had moved funds to the family entity registered to Kellen's mother, had been applied not just to the Columbus Hotel project but to 2 earlier projects in different markets. The Columbus arrangement had not been a novel scheme. It had been the 3rd iteration of a structure that worked until it stopped working. Kellen Burke's attorney filed a motion to exclude the Meridian-sourced evidence on Fourth Amendment grounds. The motion was denied in 17 days. Kellen's second attorney filed a motion for a continuance. That was granted, which meant the civil proceeding extended by 60 days, which meant that for 60 days, Kellen Burke's name appeared in the Columbus business press in contexts that required explanation every time someone searched for it. Donovan did not enjoy the press coverage. He instructed Oliver to say nothing on Meridian's behalf. And Cecilia said nothing beyond confirming that a suit had been filed, and that restraint produced a specific kind of attention, the kind that searches harder for a story when the principals refuse to give it one. The hotel project's construction, meanwhile, continued. Donovan had made a decision early in the process, in conversation with Cecilia and then separately in a conversation with himself, that the 340 workers employed on the Columbus hotel job would not lose their positions because of what their employer had done with the financing. The construction was legitimate. The building was structurally sound and professionally managed at the site level. The fraud had happened in the change order mechanism, not in the foundations or the framing. Donovan instructed Meridian to maintain the credit facility in good standing through the project's completion while the legal process addressed the fraud separately. Cecilia had raised her eyebrow when he told her this. The workers didn't choose their employer's financing structure, Donovan said. No, she said. They didn't. She made a note on her legal pad. It's the right call. It will also read well in the proceeding. That's not why I'm doing it. I know, she said. That's why it will read well. The 2 attorneys who'd been in the boardroom that morning, the ones employed by Burke Consolidated, withdrew from Kellen's representation within 3 weeks of the filing. One of them, through a colleague of Cecilia's, indicated privately that they'd discovered, in the course of their own review of the case materials, that Kellen had misrepresented to them the full scope of the intercompany transfer history when they'd agreed to take him on. They had not known, when they appeared at the boardroom event, that they were standing in a room with their client's primary fraud victim. They were, as Cecilia put it, thoroughly unhappy men. Kellen retained new counsel, a firm from Cincinnati with a reputation for aggressive defense work. They filed 4 separate motions in the first 30 days. Cecilia defeated 3 of them and accepted a modified discovery schedule on the 4th as a concession that cost Donovan's case nothing material. The discovery process produced, among other documents, 6 months of Kellen Burke's personal text messages. Oliver reviewed the full export with the forensics consultant. He came to Donovan's office with a specific paragraph flagged on page 312 of the printed summary. In a text exchange dated 9 months earlier, Kellen had written to a contact identified only as DR, "She's useful. Husband's a nonentity. Facilities manager type. Complete nonentity. I give it another 6 months before she gets tired of him and I can close the whole play." The whole play, as subsequent messages clarified, referred not to any romantic intention toward Serena, but to a plan to use her proximity to Donovan as a meridian-connected party, even if she didn't fully understand the connection, to eventually access more favorable credit terms directly. Kellen had believed, based on what Serena had told him, that Donovan was a mid-level commercial property manager with enough industry access to be useful and not enough professional standing to notice or resist being used. He had been entirely wrong on the second point. Donovan read the paragraph. He read it twice. He set the summary down on the desk with the same controlled motion he'd used to set down the folder in the boardroom, and he looked at the wall for a moment, and he thought about the way Serena had looked at Kellen at that gallery opening in February, and the performed laugh calibrated for a specific audience, and he felt something that was neither anger nor grief but a specific compound of both. That had no efficient name. He had loved Serena Vance genuinely and without performance. He had built a life alongside her with the same care and sustained attention he brought to every structure he'd ever worked on. And she had been used, not as a partner, not even as a target, but as a mechanism, a human instrument selected for its utility and discarded when its purpose was served. He wasn't sure whether that made what she had done more forgivable or simply more complete in its sadness. Probably both. The divorce proceedings began in the 3rd week of June. Serena retained an attorney and filed first, which Cecilia had anticipated and accounted for. The marital estate was more complex than Serena's team initially understood. Because the full scope of Meridian Capital Group's holdings, the commercial real estate portfolio, the equity positions, the investment structures that had been built quietly over 14 years, had not been part of any financial disclosure Serena had seen during the marriage. Her attorney's initial filing operated on the assumption of a marital estate worth approximately $1. $2 million based on visible assets, the house, the vehicles, the joint accounts. Cecilia's first responsive filing corrected that figure. The actual marital estate, properly assessed, was $140 million. Donovan had not made this calculation to punish Serena. He'd disclosed it because the law required full disclosure and because he was not, regardless of what had happened, going to conduct the dissolution of his marriage as an act of concealment or misdirection. He had done enough concealing in enough contexts for enough legitimate reasons. This was not one of them. Serena's attorney requested a 60-day extension following the corrected filing. Donovan's team granted it. Margaret Vance called Donovan's cell phone 11 days after the corrected filing was served. He let it go to voicemail. Her message was 3 minutes and 42 seconds long. He listened to it once. He didn't return the call. He did not feel the things about Margaret Vance that would have been available to feel. He felt instead a kind of tired clarity about what she'd been doing for 4 years, and a mild gratitude that the process of being honest about it was now substantially her problem rather than his. The sex formal investigation resulted, by October, in a civil enforcement action against Burke Consolidated and 3 named officers, including Kellen Burke, for securities fraud in connection with misrepresentation of fund use to investors in the hotel project. The action carried potential disgorgement of $14.2 million in civil penalties. A parallel criminal referral was made to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Kellen's Cincinnati attorneys issued a statement describing the action as overreach. Cecilia described it to Donovan as expected. The 340 workers on the Columbus hotel job completed the project in August. The hotel opened in September. Its reviews were strong. The property, as collateral, appraised at $8.9 million upon completion, covering Meridian's credit exposure with $4.7 million to spare after accounting for fees and the disputed change order amounts. Donovan attended the hotel's public opening in the third week of September. He went alone. He stood in the lobby for about 15 minutes and looked at the space, the proportions of it. The way Serena's design work had solved the problem of natural light in a north-facing building. The specific choice she'd made with the entry corridor that turned what should have been a transition space into something that made you stop. She had done that well. He was capable of acknowledging it without the acknowledgement costing him anything he couldn't afford to spend. He went home. He sat in the kitchen. He put the brass level on the counter in front of him and looked at it for a long time. There was a moment at the beginning of November when Cecilia presented Donovan with an option he hadn't initially considered. The forensic accounting work, which had been thorough and was now complete, had identified 2 additional signatories at other design firms who'd participated in the change order structure. Both of them, like Serena, in the category of participants who'd known enough to not ask questions, rather than participants who'd understood the full downstream architecture. Cecilia indicated that the civil suit could be expanded to include them, and that doing so would likely increase the damages award substantially. Donovan thought about it for 24 hours. He came back to Cecilia and told her to narrow the suit rather than expand it. The 2 additional signatories are junior professionals at smaller firms, he said. One of them has a family. If I put their names in a fraud complaint, I'm ending careers that didn't engineer this scheme. They just failed to refuse it clearly enough. That's not what I'm trying to do. The damages, Cecilia started. I'm covered, he said. The hotel asset covers Meridian's exposure. What I need from this proceeding is the fraud on the record Burke's structure dismantled, and the credit facilities protected going forward. I don't need to use this to take more than that. Cecilia made a note. There will be people who'd say you're leaving money on the table. There will always be people who'd say that, Donovan said. It's not the table I'm leaving it on. The civil settlement was reached in December. Kellen Burke and Burke Consolidated agreed to disgorgement of $3.1 million to Meridian Capital Group as part of a broader settlement that also included the sex civil enforcement action. The criminal referral remained active. That process had its own timeline and wasn't Donovan's to control or accelerate. The divorce finalized in December as well. The settlement, negotiated over 3 months, was detailed and fair. Serena received the house in Columbus, the one they'd renovated together. The one she'd made work beautifully in the specific way that she was genuinely skilled at, along with a cash settlement that reflected her 7 years as a spouse to a man whose actual wealth had not been disclosed to her in any form during their marriage. Donovan's attorneys had argued, and Donovan had agreed that the concealment of the marital estate's true scale, however legally permitted, created an equity argument that deserved honest treatment. He also ensured, through Cecilia, that Serena's exposure in the civil fraud proceeding was resolved as an unnamed participant through a separate cooperation agreement. She provided a full account of what she'd known about the change order mechanism and when, and that cooperation was credited in the proceeding in a way that kept her name out of the public record entirely. He did this not because he owed it to her. He did it because it was the narrower, more precise thing, and because he'd made a decision years ago when he'd first learned at 23 what visible wealth does to relationships, that he was going to live by a specific standard of integrity regardless of what the people around him chose to do with theirs. On the last day of December, Donovan drove out to the old warehouse outside Pittsburgh. It hadn't been used as anything for years now. The renovation that had started everything had long since been followed by the purchase and the portfolio and the holding structure that had compounded into something Raymond Marsh, working his 3 flannel shirts in rotation, would have found excessive and probably slightly embarrassing. The warehouse was cold. Donovan walked through it once, his footsteps the only sound, the high windows letting in the gray December light the way they always had. He stood in the center of the space where the futon had been, where the borrowed textbooks had been stacked against the wall, where he'd figured out, slowly, carefully, with the kind of stubbornness that only people with nothing to lose and nothing to prove can really sustain, what his name was worth. He was carrying the brass level. He'd brought it without thinking about it, the way you carry things that belong in your hands. He held it out in front of him. The bubble sat perfectly centered. The same as it always had. The same as it always would. He thought about something his father had said once, not as advice but as an observation, the way Raymond Marsh said most things worth saying. The interesting thing about a level is that it doesn't care who's holding it. It's just honest. Donovan had spent 14 years building something real and then spent the better part of a year watching the people around him try to use it for purposes they hadn't been given permission for. And now he was standing in the warehouse where it had started, and the level was still level, and he was still himself, and that was enough. More than enough, actually, if this story stayed with you, if there's something in it about patience, or precision, or what it costs to know the difference between what you owe the people who've hurt you and what you owe yourself, then you already understand what it's saying. Not every betrayal requires a fire in response. Some of them only require clarity, and the willingness to hold your ground long enough for clarity to do its work. Donovan Marsh didn't ruin anyone. He didn't need to. The structure Kellen Burke had built was self-dismantling from the moment someone looked at it honestly, and what Donovan provided was not destruction but documentation, a steady hand and a long view. Which his father had taught him were the same tool in different moments. The level is still on the counter. He moved to a smaller house outside Columbus after the divorce. A house with good bones and a north-facing kitchen that gets difficult light, which he finds he doesn't mind. He's working on the light problem. He has time. We tell stories like this every week. Stories about people who built something real and had to prove it, not with performance but with patience. If that's the kind of story you need right now, subscribe, share this with someone who'd feel something hearing it. And if you've ever had to decide between speaking up too early and waiting for the right moment, leave that in the comments. We'd genuinely like to know.